Hello and welcome to another episode of the SumerSports Show. I am your Wednesday host, Parker Fleming, here again this summer, continuing my series of interviews with smart football and sports analytics people. Got a great guest today, should be a good time. Just want to make sure that if you're listening here, you are subscribed to the YouTube channel, following us on Twitter at SumerSports, and signed up at our website, sumersports.com/the-zone. Don't want to be coy about this, but some cool stuff happening on. Going to keep talking, even though I think my Wi-Fi just went out, but here I am. I'm back. That's great. That's wonderful. And we will proceed. There we go. Just showbiz, right? It's live, and we're working with things. So I do today have on my friend and my former editor, Aaron Schatz from formerly of Football Outsiders, NFL analyst, been around the league, one of the most instrumental people in NFL analytics and using numbers to understand and grow the game. Really excited to talk to Aaron and have him on. So I'll go ahead without further ado and bring him into the broadcast. Aaron Schatz, how are you today?
Hey, I'm good. I'm doing good. August is a good time to talk football.
Absolutely. I feel like it's perpetually earlier in the summer every year that I see some inevitable dumb headline and think, okay, we need football games. But then you get that first preseason game and everybody can kind of lock in a little bit. You know, there's still some silliness with Deuce Vaughn not getting tackled at Cowboys camp and people posting videos and overreacting there. But it's still nice to know that the season is just around the corner and meaningful snaps are closer and closer every day.
If there wasn't overreacting to the fact that guys aren't supposed to touch each other, it wouldn't be training camp.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Aaron, I wanted to have you on this summer and glad we finally got it to work out. At the very top, do want to plug you did write your preview almanac again this year with FTN this season. I tweeted a link just under the announcement tweets for this, and people can find that on your Twitter, getting to cover all 32 NFL teams and orchestrating that. Aaron, the almanac is probably how I first heard about you, honestly. How long have you been doing the preseason almanac?
This is the 19th preseason book. We started in 2005 when we were associated with Baseball Prospectus, and the book was called Pro Football Prospectus 2005. And then it became Football Outsiders Almanac in 2009 and became the FTN Football Almanac this year.
Interesting. 19 years. I was thinking about what I was doing in 2005, and I think it involves listening to My Chemical Romance and sneaking out of my parents' house to go hang out with my friends. So,
I'm old. Yeah. I've been doing this
it for a while. Yeah, that's awesome. Well, that's a great segue and kind of a nice detour here. Tell me a little bit about kind of how you started out getting into analytics. Obviously, want to build up, and we'll talk about the metrics that you've made and what you think is important in the game today. But generally, where did you get your start in kind of football and writing about football and starting to use numbers to better understand the game?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I'm not a trained statistician. For folks who don't know, I'm basically just a writer who liked to use stats. Grew up as a fan of Bill James. I do have an economics degree, so that's where I have a little bit of statistical knowledge. But, you know, I became a heavy football fan in the 90s, and especially the late 90s. And the Patriots won the Super Bowl in 2001, which was fantastic. That's my team. That's where I live. 2002, they didn't make the playoffs. And one of the local reporters, Ron Borges, wrote that they didn't make the playoffs because they couldn't establish the run. And I thought, that doesn't make sense to me. And I had read The Hidden Game of Football, and I loved some of the ideas in The Hidden Game of Football. I was like, why is nobody doing anything with this now that we have the internet? Like someone could start a site and just do something with these numbers, but nobody's doing it. And I want to see, like Bill James started just with questions, right? He just has, how much do catchers batter for stolen bases, right? So he started just counting things out of the box scores. So I'm like, I'm going to do the same thing. So I just started counting things out of the play-by-play to see whether establishing the run made any difference, right? If you ran the ball more in the first quarter, did it lead to more wins? And of course, the answer we all know now is no. And then I had done that, and I had this database of every play in the season from 2002. And then I'm like, I bet I could do some more stuff with this. And then I started to apply some of the ideas from Hidden Game. And that's where DVOA came about. And then I decided to start a site. Got a couple of my fraternity brothers to work on it with me. One of them was the designer. One of them did cartoons. A couple of guys wrote a fantasy column. And we launched it in July of 2003.
Dang, July of 2003. So it's funny to see one. I'm pulling up. I think I have Hidden Game of Football here, and if I'm not mistaken, you have a Ford in the new edition of this one.
Yes,
so,
there is a new
cool
re-release. Re-release
Yeah.
Hidden Game of Football where I did the forward.
Yeah, this has been great, and this and Mathletics are kind of the two that I read and was able to say like, oh. Overall, I'm really think that I might be having Wi-Fi issues. I'm sorry if I come back and out there, Aaron. I apologize for that. Hopefully my connection is stable and it's not too bad on my end. It is funny to hear you have kind of the villain origin story of established Saran. I feel like that's a lot of people saying like, no, this doesn't match my eyes, and I want to dig deeper. So you start putting pen to paper, you start tracking some numbers, and you eventually come up with these two separate but related metrics of DVOA and DYAR. So let's separate these out as much as we need to. And can you kind of give me overview, like the elevator pitch, how you kind of came up with the idea of DVOA and what question it answers for football teams?
So remember back when Hidden Game, there was no like publicly available play-by-play when I started. There was no publicly available EPA. There was, I had to create the database myself by cutting and pasting out of ESPN.com, right? And Hidden Game of Football had this system of success points, right? That if you had a success on a play, it was 1 point. And then if you got 80% of the needed yards, it was 2, and 100% was 3. And if you got an explosive play was 4, and a turnover was -6. And I took that and I'm like, let's play with this. And I started to put together which players had the most success points. And I came up with Mike Allstott as the best running back in the league in 2002. And that seemed weird to me. And that's when I came up with the idea of over average, because I'm like, Mike Allstott gets the ball in situations where he is likely to have success. So instead of comparing Mike Allstott, just how much success does he have, why don't we compare him to what the average running back does in the same situations? And that's where the baseline came in. And then I did the adjustments for opponent. And then I ended up with Priest Holmes as the most valuable running back of 2002. And that made a lot more sense. And I just took it from there. And I realized I could do this for teams and for players. And that was the start of DVOA. And then eventually I realized I needed to do something for special teams. So special teams is, DVOA is based on this success points model. Right? It's not like an EPA model. It's the success points model. The special teams DVOA is basically based on an EPA model. It's just, I've turned it into DVOA by looking at like this many expected points over average usually equals this much DVOA. When you add it to offense and defense, how do you get the best correlation with winning? So that's how we get the special teams DVOA. And then we came up with DYAR because we realized that DVOA really, really liked some players who were not regulars, right? Not starters. It really loved like Mo Williams. And I was like, well, there's some value in starting. There's some value in having the ball a lot. There's some value in being able to take a lot of targets or being able to take a lot of carries. So we came up with the idea of a total stat that was, instead of value over average, was value over replacement level. Although I'll point out, I use replacement level, I think, in a different way than some other people do. When I mean replacement level, I mean the average backup, not the average USFL player.
Okay.
Right?
Interesting.
It would be different if it was because for DYAR, you're trying to figure out the value of a player over his backups, not over some scrub on the street. If we did some scrub on the street, the calculations would be different because obviously the level of real replacement level players is lower than just backups.
Yeah. On a future podcast episode, maybe I can talk about my pokes methodology, which is points over Kyle Sloter, speaking of USFL and the replacement level. But okay, that's really interesting. It raises a ton of questions because obviously at Sumer, we're working on a lot of these questions personnel sides and trying to really dig deep into these. And so we've been thinking a lot about these, and really, really interesting. So first, value over average, I think is a big question of,
I think we lost you, man.
thinking about it. I just went black. There we go. Okay, I'm back. I apologize to the listeners. I'm not sure. I think I might be having outages. I was having a little bit of trouble earlier, and so I apologize for that. When you're talking about average, you're talking about if it's almost a way to imagine if this guy goes down to injury and they have to bring somebody in immediately, not could they go get somebody else entirely. So your average level is
well, no,
is
that's what I'm thinking about with That's what I'm thinking about with replacement level is more like, what is the average? What is the quality of the average backup? Average is just average, right? Average is just half the players in the league are better than this and half the players in the league are worse than this. Average. My thought about replacement level for DYAR is it's not dependent on who the actual backup is, but the average backup in the league. Like, how is this player compared to like the average backup in the league? Not the average guy off the street.
Okay.
Who's not on a 53-man roster.
Interesting. Okay. So it makes sense. So kind of all around the league. And then, so I have a question about kind of replacement and the situational aspect of it, but I'll ask that in a second. First, when you're adjusting for opponents, and again, I'm not asking you to give away all the secret sauce or anything, but just a general framework, how are you adjusting for defenses? How does DVOA take VOA and say, all right, let's account for who's on the other side of the field?
It goes through a couple of iterations of, what is the difference between like this off, what is the difference between an offense and average on a given down and distance? And then what is the difference between, and then it uses that to adjust defenses. And then it says, what's the difference between the offense adjusted defense and average on these down and distances? And then it uses that again to adjust offense. And if I wanted to make it more complicated, I'm sure I could make it a little bit more accurate by doing it, instead of 2 levels of going back and forth, there'd be 4 levels or 6 or as many levels as it takes for it to stabilize if I was a better computer programmer. But that's the basic idea, is not just to look. Originally, I was just looking at like, what do defenses do on this down and distance, and then compare it to average. And then I realized, oh no, we should do another level of like offense adjusted defenses.
Yeah, that makes sense. Kind of that back and forth. And so, would you say that DVOA kind of captures inherent run pass splits? I know that it's probably a bigger issue in college football, which I'm much more familiar with. But obviously, whether you're successful on the ground game or successful in the pass game certainly matters. Does controlling for the situation and then adjusting based on that, do you think that sufficiently captures maybe some selection issues with running and passing versus different teams?
Yeah, I mean, offensively, like passing is always comes out more efficient than running, right? Like the average DVOA for all the plays being considered is 0. So the average for all passing plays is always above 0, and for rushing plays, it's below 0. So yeah, if you're a team that is less efficient running, but you run the ball too much, your rating's going to be lower because it's based on the actual plays that you've run. So I think it does account then for like what your pass run ratio is. And are you doing, are you a good rushing team that's running a lot, or are you a bad rushing team that's running a lot?
Right. And yeah, it's what do you want to do, and then how well do you do it? Certainly matters in that. Okay, and then so DYAR in kind of a way does account for another kind of selection bias, which is when the players are on the field matter. You mentioned Mike Allstott in terms of just one accounting for over average. Helps a little bit, but you think about Jerome Bettis is a great example. Towards the end of his career was, averaging 2 yards per carry, but
I think
6 touchdowns a game.
I think he had like a positive DVOA that year, that he had like 3 yards a carry because it was mostly on things like 2nd and 2. Yeah. So
yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So that usage. So in what way does DYAR account for that, or kind of help solve that problem of the perpetual problem of on-off splits in the NFL, and how there's a usage issue with
I don't know if it really solves the problems of on-off splits, but what it does is it makes good players. It makes average players who get a lot of usage come out higher than good players who don't get a lot of usage, right? So the idea is to try to figure out how much value players have compared to the average backup and to consider volume. Now, the one thing I will say is the receiving is based on targets. And the more research that gets done, the more we feel like it really should be based on routes, not targets. But I've never had that data. So now I kind of do. So I'm actually working on, or have worked on, a DVOA version of receiving that's based on routes instead of targets. And wherever my next home is, I'm going to unveil that and I'm going to try to adjust, keep that going during the season, because I think it's more accurate. The problem, of course, is we don't have that data for the past, right? I have DVOA going all the way back to 1981. We do not have route run data for, the Mike Quick.
Right. Yeah. So that certainly does kind of hurt when it is a retroactive and looking backwards and trying to say, how can I couch all this in the data that I have looking forward? I mean, stuff on the cutting edge right now, stuff like even yards per route run, I think just helps contextualize so much, not just how often was this guy on the field, but when he was actually involved, how productive was he?
Example,
and kind of assigning credit.
DVOA based on routes rather than targets. Tyreek Hill comes out as the most valuable receiver in the league rather than Justin Jefferson, because of what he did with fewer routes. DeAndre Hopkins comes out much higher. Devontae Parker comes out much lower. Just to give a couple of examples of how things change. And the correlation from year to year, which doesn't mean everything, but suggests that it's more, that we're measuring something more intrinsic. The correlation from year to year is much higher than it is for the DVOA based on targets. So I am looking forward to introducing that and trying to program to do it during the season, because I do think it's an interesting, more accurate look at who's a good receiver, and because earning targets does matter.
Yeah, absolutely. And presumably usage is more sticky year over year than the output or even getting targeted. And that also accounts for things like guy has a breakout season. Next year, he might get more gravity from the defense and more attention. And so his production numbers might be less, but because he's still out there, still running, has a lot of routes, he's getting covered. That's opening up pressure for the rest of the offense to be able to attack and kind of counterpunch. So we might see a discrepancy in his production without seeing a discrepancy in his.
I'd love to be able to go back and do it for the past for a guy like Chris Chambers, who our numbers hate. Our numbers hate Chris Chambers because he had such a low catch rate and he was so inefficient, but he got lots of targets. So I'm curious what this would do for him, but we don't have route data for like 2003.
Yeah. No, that would be ideal. That would be ideal. Okay. One more. I'll press just a little bit on this and then we can kind of move forward. But so one more issue, right? DVOA assigning to individual players. There are 11 people on the field.
Right.
Other linemen versus wide receivers or running backs. So when you say Mike Allstott, had the highest DVOA, or I guess he had the highest value, you said Priest Holmes has the highest DVOA. When I look at that, first question is that a descriptive metric of what he has done or a predictive look at what I expect him to do going forward?
It's a little bit kind of a combination of both. It's sort of halfway in between, although I'm working on making it more predictive because I think that's what people are looking for from it. But it's definitely does not separate a player from his teammates or his surroundings, right? Like if you have a good quarterback, you'll be higher in DVOA. If you have a bad quarterback, you'll be lower. That's what's so impressive about guys who do so well with bad quarterbacks, right? Like, Steve Smith in his best years, right? Like, it's definitely like there's a thing in the book where we talk about how we can't separate the players. It's not like we're grading all the players and assigning this to the offensive line and this to the receivers and, looking at what receivers are doing when they're not targeted. And so, it is, like EPA, it's and like regular stats, it's, somewhat dependent on your teammates.
Yeah, which, also, so is the game of football. Guess what? If you have a better quarterback, your team is going to be better. So certainly makes sense there. Interesting. Okay, so you've got DVOA, you've got DYAR, you've got the DVOA with routes run, kind of these improvements and tinkering. Those are great tools. been tested for years, kind of give a very good, I like that you mentioned the leaderboard test at the very beginning of, hey, Mike Allstott at the top did not pass the leaderboard test, but Priest Holmes did. How do you take something like DVOA and look at a team throughout the course of the season and decide, hey, were they good? Were they bad? Is this a team that I expect to be better in the future, worse in the future? How do you use DVOA as a tool to kind of assess the quality of a team?
I think that that's interesting. I mean, for offense and defense rather than player stats, like looking at team stats, it's more predictive than just like raw EPA, or certainly more predictive than like wins and losses. And you can see why, one of the advantages of DVOA from the very beginning is that it is play-by-play based. So you can split things up by down, or like look at just the red zone, or look at just certain situations. And that there's certain situations that tend to regress towards the mean. For example, that performance in the red zone is more important than performance overall, but it tends to regress towards whatever your performance is overall, right? If you're a bad offense, but you're good in the red zone, you are more likely to be bad in the red zone going forward. If you're a good offense, but you're bad in the red zone, you're more likely to be good in the red zone going forward, because what matters more is your performance overall. So third downs have sort of a similar effect, particularly on defense, less so on offense. So you can look at some of the splits and get an idea of where the team is going to get better in the future. Same goes for special teams, right? We know that field goals are very unpredictable. Returns and punts are much more predictive. So you can look at certain splits and get a better idea of where teams going to be playing well in the future.
Yeah, and then from there, you get broad brush with the team level DVOA, and then you can start to compare. I think that it's probably super useful to go in and say running back A has a 3.9 DVOA, running back B has a negative 0.45 EPA.
Right, with the same
DVOA, sorry.
Right, with the same offensive line and the same scheme. Like, when sometimes comparing players on different teams can be tough because their surroundings are different. But when you're comparing players on the same team, Joe Horn used to blow away the rest of the Saints receivers, right? It was like it was a testament to how good he was that he would have these positive ratings while the rest of the Saints receivers were terrible.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. That tools that help us better understand the game, help us peel back layers and kind of add some context are always super valuable. Want to ask you about the almanac and kind of what you look for predictively, like as you're previewing a season, a team. What are some market fundamentals that you're looking for? Before I do that, real quick, just want to remind you, see a bunch of people here watching right now. If you've got a question for Aaron, please throw it in the comments. Would love to ask him. Well, I think we'll find some time at the end here to answer some of those. So please, if you're on YouTube or on Twitter, any question you got for Aaron, throw it in there, and we'll try to make time to get to it. Yeah. So Aaron, so writing the almanac, again, something you've done consistently, but when you're applying DVOA to the next year, what are kind of the market fundamentals you look for in a team to say, hey, they're going to take a step. Hey, they're going to be worse than I thought. Hey, they're going to maintain this level of play year over year.
Yeah, there's certain, combinations of down and distance that are more predictive than others. Definitely, and especially for defenses, turnovers go into the projection system, right? Teams are very likely to regress on their turnover margin. In offense, there's a separate projection for the quarterback, so that if a team changes quarterbacks, we can try to do, it's hard to do a projection of a quarterback separate from his teammates, but we try as much as possible to be, to know what the difference is between Tim Tebow and Peyton Manning, right? And then we look at the coach experience, right? Usually teams that are learning a new system take a step back, all other things being equal. And we look at personnel changes, right? One of the big improvements we made to our projections a few years ago was including a variable for personnel changes. And then we tweaked that so certain positions matter more than others. I think people who watch this show know which positions matter more than others, right? Like we use approximate value over replacement. Approximate value is a broad brush, but it's somewhat useful. And replacement level is 3. And edge rushers and defensive backs matter a lot more than off-ball linebackers. And, we've looked at projections in the past to show that that's the case, right? That's one of the reasons why Chicago is pretty down in our projections because people are excited about the off-ball linebackers that they added, and our system is not that excited about the off-ball linebackers they added because they're off-ball linebackers. So you definitely want to look at, certain splits like red zone and third downs, and then personnel changes and coaching. And turnover margin is a really big one on defense.
Turnover margin in the sense that if it's high, we don't expect it to be as high last year, or
if it's high, we don't expect it to be as high next year. And if it's low, we don't expect it to be as low next year. That's why the Jets and the Commanders are so interesting, because the Jets and the Commanders had top defenses last year, despite having low takeaway rates, low turnover rates. And so the likely regression for various reasons for the Jets and Commanders is sort of countered by the fact that they're likely to have more takeaways this year, which of course is important for defenses. Yeah,
absolutely. That's one thing I always like to look at in college football is the like percent of drives that started across your opponent's 50. Because that number, I think, that's how you circle like, oh, you had an unsustainable season. I think last year Notre Dame blocked something like 7 punts. And so that's in all my notes this season to be like, yeah, let's downgrade that offense a little bit. I don't think that's happening again.
Yeah, I've never found that blocked kicks are predictive of future blocked kicks. They're what I call non-predictive plays, because I don't want to call them lucky, because they're not. You practice, you design, you go out there and you do it. And somebody makes a play, and it's not luck, that's skill, but it's not necessarily predictive of the future.
Yeah. Very, very hard to replicate. And I did talk a little bit with some college coaches about like why they spend so much time, trying to practice those. And one answer kind of bluntly was like, we need something for the twos to do while the offensive linemen are taking a breather. Like, we just got to work in the special teams. I don't even know if they think that they can replicate it, but still it's so these random aspects of the game and kind of push forward to say, hey, we have this good idea of the ecosystem of these are the sustainable metrics. These are the unsustainable metrics. These are the personnel decisions that are going to matter. These are the coaching changes that are going to matter. And you pull that forward and you push that into 2023. So here, almost 28 minutes into this podcast now, would love to turn an eye and talk a little bit about 2023 and some teams this year. So I'm going to pretend to be naive about the NFL. The one question I will definitely ask you is about my Titans. Again, I'm the most casual Titans fan in the history of the NFL. But before we go on that, let's start at the top. Aaron, why are the Chiefs not going to win the Super Bowl this year?
I was going to say,
that's stopping them.
As a college fan, the most important thing I can tell you is that 21 years ago, the NFL figured out how geography worked, which is a problem in college right now.
Look, time's not linear. Space is just a construct.
They figured out that Atlanta was not in the West. Why are Kansas City not going to win the Super Bowl? From a projection standpoint, the answer is we have their defense declining a little bit. We still have them projected with the most we simulate the season 50,000 times. We have them projected with the most wins in the AFC, but we have Buffalo projected as a little bit better of a team. So, I mean, I'll admit part of my picking Buffalo for people who've seen my pick on other media sources is Buffalo, San Francisco, that a little bit of that is, I don't want to pick Kansas City yet again. But also, I think, Buffalo is our number one DVOA team in projections. They just, they have a hard schedule, so they don't have as many wins as Kansas City. Kansas City is the number one offense, and we know that offense is easier to predict than defense. So I'm more likely wrong about the Kansas City defense than I am their offense. Like, their offense is probably going to be at the top of the league, and the defense could be better than we think. But that's the answer is I'm not predicting them because the defense.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. And it is interesting to see how close kind of the AFC contenders have been there with, Buffalo and Cincinnati being, within a play of potentially beating Kansas City and Cincinnati, of course, being so close in the Super Bowl a couple years ago. One AFC team I've kind of looked at again, my college background makes me keep an eye on this. The Ravens making a pretty big change at offensive coordinator and bringing in Munkin from the ranks to try and make the offense a little more explosive, a little more going forward. How do you account for a change like that where a guy moves up from college? And what do you expect the Ravens offense to do kind of from a statistical sense compared to where they were last year?
I think we expect the Ravens offense to be better, but that's primarily because we expect them to have Lamar Jackson for most of the, Lamar Jackson's odds of getting injured are the same as every other quarterback. It's not like last year when he was injured. The thing about new coordinators is you really can't account for them in a projection system because, except for the fact that they're new, because we don't have a track record of Monken in a lot of places to go, okay, we know that when Todd Monken joins an offense, that offense improves. Right. It's very rare that we have a coordinator or coach who does a certain side of the ball who has that many stops where you're always like, okay, this coordinator makes things better. The only one I can think of that I might put a special variable in for is Wade Phillips. Because Wade Phillips really has been in like 9 places and has a history of turning defenses around right away. But like this is like even Kyle Shanahan, right? The Atlanta offense was not good his first year there, right? It took him time for everybody to learn his system. This is part of why our Miami projection is not as high as people think it should be, because Vic Fangio does not have a history of turning defenses around immediately. It takes some time. When he went to Chicago, they were like the worst defense in the league his first year there. And then they were like the number 1 defense in the league, like his 4th year there. So the idea that he's going to come in and suddenly, boom, like Dolphins, awesome, is, possible, but I don't think it's likely, especially now with Ramsey hurt. But, even before Ramsey was hurt. So with Monken, it's like we don't have like a history. Like he's only been at one NFL team before this, right? So it's not like we have a history of him, turning offenses around immediately. The same goes for like Eric Bieniemy. Like just because Eric Bieniemy's been with a great offense for the last few years doesn't mean suddenly Washington's offense is going to be better, because there's nothing that tells you that what was going on with Kansas City was Bieniemy as opposed to Reed or Mahomes. Sean Payton, same thing, right? All we basically have is a bunch of Drew Brees years. It's not like we have 4 different places where Sean Payton made offenses good. So in general, the only thing is that learning a new system is, all other things being equal, usually you take a step back.
Yeah. And that's a good point about kind of the identification there. That doesn't mean that Sean Payton can't come in and raise the Broncos, right. Broncos floor substantially. And some of their underlying metrics might suggest that there is some positive regression and maybe some vibes that might make it not as bad as last year. But it does mean that, like, if we're trying to assign credit, it's very hard to say, chicken and the egg. Is it Payton because of Brees? Is it Brees because of Payton? And the truth is obviously a little bit of muddy between both of those.
Right. And also, you don't know, just because Peyton did it in New Orleans, can he do it in Denver? Unless right. Unless it's like Wade Phillips and he's done it in like 9 different places. And then you're like, okay, that sample size, I can go with that. I mean, yeah. I know that's in real statistics, that's a super small sample size, but for an NFL coach, that's a pretty big sample.
Yeah. It's kind of the opposite of like fool me once. It's like, hey, if you do it once, I'm skeptical, but if you do it a couple times, okay, I believe that right. that you could plausibly do this. And it does take time. There's always that urge from fans or that desire to say, oh, maybe if we just flip this one switch, we just hire Todd Monken, then our offense is going to take off. We're going to win the Super Bowl next year.
We think Peyton is going to make Denver much better, but NFL history is filled with coaches who the second time around couldn't do what they did the first time around, like Mike Shanahan in Washington, like Joe Gibbs the second time. It's not necessarily that Sean Payton's going to be awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. Turns out coaching in the NFL is very, very difficult, and sustaining it is also very difficult. Cool. Well, we have a couple minutes here. Let's flip over to the NFC, because I'm very interested. DVOA, not a believer in the Eagles replicating their run from last year, making it to the Super Bowl. You said San Francisco is your pick. What separates San Francisco from the Eagles going this season?
I mean, the Eagles are still the number 3 team in the NFC by our projections. So I don't feel like the Eagles are suddenly, like, we don't have the Eagles suddenly crashing out. We have them regressing a little bit on offense, a little bit on defense, a little bit on special teams. The defense especially, you've got that plexiglass principle that Bill James always talked about, which is the defenses that improve significantly from one year to the next tend to take a step back in year 3. And the Eagles defense improved significantly from 2021 to 2022. So we expect them to take a little bit of a step back. And they have a tough schedule. Their schedule is 10th in the league. Harder than Dallas's and much harder than San Francisco's schedule. So it's not that we don't think the Eagles are a good team, because we have the Eagles really good. It's just, see, what happens is if you look at the table in the book, you see the Eagles right there with the Falcons and Saints, and you think we're crazy. But that's all about the Falcons and Saints schedule. Because if you look at actual DVOA projections, Philadelphia is 6th and Atlanta is 16th. There's a big gap there.
Yeah, absolutely. And the schedule does matter so much, especially with it being unbalanced. Okay, I have to ask about, so there's another a team that stood out last year that I think analytics does a good job of casting some light on. The Vikings, 13-4, but a -3 point differential on the season. Where does DVOA see a team like that really did skate by on the just absolute skin of its teeth last season? What do they expect them to do this year?
I'm sure everybody watching this show and everyone familiar with Sumer knows about the Vikings last year. It was an insane year. It was the biggest overperformance of Pythagorean wins in NFL history. And as much as advanced stats did not like the Vikings, DVOA liked the Vikings less than other advanced stats did. We had them 27th for the season, like crazy low. And then they went out and lost talent. No more Adam Thielen, no more Zadarius Smith, no more Patrick Peterson, no more Dalvin Cook, although that's less important because we know the running back position generally doesn't move the needle too much. But so if they are 27th again, they're going to win 6 games. And that's basically what we have projected. We have them projected 26th. We have them projected where their DVOA is about as good as it was last year, except now they win as many games as a team with that DVOA normally wins, instead of going crazy, ridiculous 13-4.
Yeah. That's one where, I mean, even net points alone, but those advanced metrics where you can say like, hey, we really have to talk about how they got there and not just the final point total at the end of the game.
Defense
really can help you see.
Kirk Cousins by stats, right? I realized, like, my man Derek Klassen, who was the film writer for Football Outsiders, went on Purple Insider this week and said he feels like Cousins improved last year from a scouting perspective. From a stats perspective, Cousins took a step back last year. But what was really bad was the defense. Yeah. And then the defense went out and lost some more players, right? So they're depending on like a 3rd-round pick and a 4th-round pick to be their starting cornerbacks. And they have basically one main, pass rusher, which is Danielle Hunter. So, mostly it's not a diss on Cousins or the offense. Mostly this is about the defense. Yeah.
Makes a ton of sense, especially, margins are thin and you take a step back. You've got to get some of those new guys in there. It's hard.
They have the best receiver in the game, but what are the odds he can do what he did last year again? Nobody has that season twice in a row, let alone 3 times in a row. I mean, Jefferson's been amazing.
Yeah. Well, and that's interesting. That kind of segues to a question I'd written down and was interested in. It kind of is pertinent to the Eagles, but I think it's a better example to ask it here. How much do you subscribe to the idea of kind of a target on someone's back dramatically changing play? I know I suggested that earlier about gravity, but so Justin Jefferson, has an amazing season, is kind of the one-trick pony of the Vikings offense. They lose a couple other pieces. How do you, I don't even know if you could do this statistically, but even in your head or as you're projecting a team, how much do you account for the idea, that's known. That's a known commodity. There's this one kind of feature of this offense. Let's account and maybe adjust them downward because I don't think they're going to be able to replicate that.
I don't think we account for that. Some of it is that there's a difference between what I would call a bottom-up projection system and a top-down projection system. And neither of those is better than the other one. It's just a different way of looking at things. A bottom-up projection system would take something like PFF grades or Kevin Cole's plus minus for every player and say, given these 11 starters and these 5 backups or whatever, how good will this offense be? Yeah. Whereas a top-down projection system is like, given that this was these offenses' stats last year in certain situations, how good will this offense be without looking as much? I mean, we do have a quarterback variable special and we do have certain personnel variables, but in general, we're looking less at the intricacies of the specific players on the team. And therefore, there's really no place in our projection system to look at like, oh, if Thielen is gone, Jefferson will get more attention, and therefore Jefferson will not do as well, and maybe Addison will do better because he won't get attention because no one expects anything from a rookie. Like, that's not really built into the team projections at all.
Yeah, and would be maybe a maddening exercise to even try to account for the levels there.
I mean, again, that's part of why. I mean, this, my thing I've said for 20 years. That's why there's words next to the numbers, right? That's why we write a book of words that explain the numbers, because sometimes there are things like that, or I'm worried about Mike McCarthy's play calling that aren't in the numbers, but you want to say it.
Yeah, absolutely. And love that approach, and certainly vibe with that approach. And I think it's the way to do that. Almost like a Chicago School of Economics kind of thing, where we don't have theory without evidence, but we don't have evidence without theory. We need all that together to better understand and fully know what's going on. Aaron, got one or two questions I'm going to get to here that are in the queue. Before we do that, one team that's going to surprise us, good or bad, in the almanac. And don't tell us your reasoning. Make us go to the almanac. I just want to know who's going to surprise me.
Cleveland.
Ooh, we might follow up on that, because I think we might have similar thoughts there. Interesting. Cleveland, gonna surprise. To read more, gotta go get that almanac at FTN from Aaron this fall. Okay, let's do. I've got a couple in here. Anybody else that's watching, you got a question for Aaron? Throw it in here. We might have time for one or two more, but I will get to both of these. Dexter Davis asks two here. One, he says, I'm a biostatistician looking to get into football analytics. What languages are you programming in? I think Aaron's answer to that might be a resounding, it really doesn't matter.
I'm very old school. Like I said, I'm not a trained statistician, and I'm really a writer who got into using numbers. Numbers are my colors. They're the colors in my palette when I paint a picture, but I am a writer first and foremost. So, I mean, the God's honest truth is I still do a lot of stuff in Excel, but I also use R. And so I can't tell you, I'm not taking a position in the R versus Python debate. I'll just say, if you're young and you want to get into this, you better learn either R or Python. And if I was 20 years younger, I'd be a lot better at R and Python than I am now.
Absolutely. And I would just say we use R and we use Python, and it doesn't matter. If you know something, use that. And odds are, if you're smart and analytical minded and you need to learn the other tool, you can. I wouldn't focus on tools generally. His second question, a little more applicable to you, Aaron. I think top 2 to 3 books to read to learn more about football analytics after you read Hidden Game of Football.
That's
I mentioned
really interesting question. Yeah, go ahead. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say, I mentioned Mathletics. Wayne Winston, Scott Nestler, who works at Sumer, director of research and development, helped do a rewrite of Mathletics that just came out. That's a really, really good one I would recommend too. They have a bunch of football stuff in there. Anything else you've got, Aaron?
I mean, I recommend the Football Outsiders Almanac, obviously. It's the honest truth is that all the analytics work is online. It's never really turned into a lot of books. I mean, Casey Joyner wrote a one-off book at one point, and we have the almanac every year, but there's no like one book that's like, this is where all the analytics is, in part because so much stuff has been done in just the last few months. Like, I've been approached to write like an evergreen book, like a this is all of football analytics in one book type book. And so much has changed. So much changes in a few months, especially with next gen stats being available now, that like by the time I'd be done with the book, some of it would already be out of date. So the best stuff is really online, and just follow the right people on Twitter or Threads or whatever, and obviously I'm a big fan of following me, but follow Sumer, and there's the PFF people, and there's lots of good stuff being done, and most of it's online, not in books. The one book to really read is Hidden Game of Football.
Yeah. I think that's totally fair. And again, just having a mindset of, hey, I'm reading this to understand how to ask and answer interesting questions in football analytics is super important. Aaron Schatz NFL analyst, editor of the FTN Football Almanac. You can get that online. Links in his Twitter profile at @AShotsNFL right there on the screen. Thanks so much for being here today. Really enjoyed this conversation and your perspective, and hope that, Aaron, you have a great season this fall. There's certainly a lot of storylines I'm excited about, and we'll be looking forward to your work this fall.
I'm ready. Figure out next couple of weeks exactly where I'm going to be for the new season, but it will be somewhere. DVOA lives on. And thanks for having me. Love all the stuff that Sumer is doing. So it's good to be part of the show.
I appreciate it so much. Thanks everybody for watching. Make sure you like, subscribe, review, all that fun stuff. Share the show with a football person that that likes the game. And other than that, we'll be back next week.